The wine struck me before I finished putting down the pen. 1 second. Lauren was standing beside my son with her fingers wrapped around the stem of a crystal glass. The next. Red wine splashed across my face, my white shirt, and the retirement papers they had ordered me to sign. Jason did not apologize. He leaned over the table, his jaw trembling, and said, "You're being selfish. You'd rather watch this company die than let me lead it." I wiped my glasses with the linen napkin while the restaurant fell silent around us. Then Lauren muttered something that bothered me more than the wine. "Call your lawyer. The bank already recognizes Jason." I did not argue or raise my voice. I sent one text to Margaret Cole: "Stop every transfer. Lock the trust. Start an independent audit tonight." At that moment, I still thought my son wanted my company. I had no idea someone had already used my name to begin taking it. My name is Robert Whitaker, and this is how one family dinner uncovered a betrayal years in the making. Stay with me, because the signature that nearly ruined me was not placed on those papers that night. To explain where it came from, I have to go back 3 months. I was 68 years old when I announced that I would step away from the daily operations of Whitaker Architectural Millworks, the company I had built from a rented garage outside Columbus, Ohio. We made custom staircases, paneled libraries, carved doors, and the kind of hardwood interiors most people only saw in magazines. After 38 years, we had 52 employees, annual revenue of nearly $15 million, and a reputation I valued more than the numbers. My son Jason had worked beside me for 14 years and served as director of operations for the last 6. He knew the production floor, could calm an angry contractor, and remembered every employee's child by name. What he did not have was patience, especially where I was concerned. I had decided to make him president of operations while hiring an experienced outside chief executive for a 2-year transition. In my mind, that protected Jason from being overwhelmed. In his mind, it proved that I would never trust him. Instead of explaining my fears honestly, I told him he was not ready. It was a sentence I had used too many times, and every time I said it, I watched something in his face close. My wife, Susan, would have handled the conversation better. She had died 3 years earlier after a short fight with pancreatic cancer, leaving me with a large house, a quiet kitchen, and the uncomfortable knowledge that she had understood our son in ways I never had. Susan used to tell me that I treated money like a substitute for language. When Jason wanted independence, I gave him a job. When he wanted respect, I helped him buy company shares through an interest-free loan. When he and Lauren struggled after their daughter Emma was born, I let them live in a cottage owned by our family trust for almost nothing. When Lauren's design business lost a major client, I sent contracts her way instead of asking why her expenses kept growing. I believed I was supporting them. Looking back, I was also making sure they continued to need me. That did not excuse what they later did, but it explained why Jason could accept help for years and still feel controlled. I had built doors for half the mansions in central Ohio, yet I never noticed the one my own son had begun closing between us. The first warning arrived in the form of a cash flow report from Martin Hale, our chief financial officer and my closest friend in business. Martin was 64 and had worked with me for 25 years. He had stood beside me at Susan's funeral, driven me home after my heart surgery, and owned 15% of the company. When he entered my office one Monday morning with a yellow folder under his arm, I expected another complaint about lumber prices. Instead, he told me we were facing a serious liquidity problem. According to his report, 2 major clients were late on payments. Material costs had risen sharply, and our available cash could fall below payroll requirements before the end of the quarter. I studied the columns, but did not immediately understand why the figures looked worse than the production numbers I reviewed each week. Martin spoke gently, almost apologetically. "Jason thinks the transition needs to happen faster," he said. "The banks want one clear leader." I asked whether we were in danger. Martin paused long enough to make his answer feel important. "Not if everyone cooperates." At the time, I thought he meant cooperation between father and son. I did not realize he was testing how frightened I could be made. Jason began requesting private meetings without department heads present. He brought proposed organization charts, transition schedules, and lists of decisions he said I was delaying. Some of his complaints were fair. I still approved purchases that should have been his responsibility, and I occasionally called supervisors directly instead of following the chain of command. But he wanted more than operational authority. He wanted my voting control transferred immediately, arguing that customers and lenders needed proof the company had entered a new era. I told him leadership was earned through decisions, not handed over through signatures. He heard that as another insult. "I've given you 14 years," he said during one meeting. "What exactly are you waiting to see?" I should have answered him plainly. I was afraid that if I gave up control, I would lose the last purpose I had after Susan died. Instead, I said, "I'm waiting for you to stop acting like the title is owed to you." Jason stared at me, gathered his papers, and left without another word. 10 minutes later, Martin appeared in my doorway and told me I had been too hard on him. It was the first time I wondered whether my son and my oldest friend were discussing me before they spoke to me. Lauren increased the pressure outside the office. She invited me to dinner, dropped by the house with Emma, and spoke constantly about legacy, family, and how hard Jason worked. She never directly asked for money, but every conversation seemed to circle back to security. Her design company had expanded too quickly after winning a hotel project in Indianapolis. The developer delayed payment. Lauren borrowed against future contracts, and several subcontractors demanded balances she could not immediately cover. I knew she had problems, though she told me the situation was temporary. During one Sunday visit, she stood in Susan's old kitchen, looked through the windows toward the company workshop, and said, "Jason needs to know there will be something left for Emma." I reminded her that Emma was already a beneficiary of the family trust. Lauren's expression tightened. "A trust controlled by you and your attorney isn't the same as security." That sentence stayed with me. Margaret Cole was not merely my attorney. She was an independent co-trustee, because Susan had insisted no single family member should control the house and land. Lauren knew that. Her resentment was not about whether Emma was protected. It was about who held the keys. A month before the restaurant dinner, Jason brought me a glossy presentation prepared by an investment group called Northline Capital Partners. They proposed lending the company $1.6 million for expansion, refinancing equipment debt, and developing unused land behind our workshop. The presentation described the arrangement as a growth partnership, but I noticed the photographs focused more on the land than the business. Our property sat near a corridor where warehouses and luxury apartments were replacing older industrial sites. Northline's plan required a broad security interest in company assets, and one map appeared to include the boundary of my home. I asked Jason why private trust property was shaded as part of the transaction. He said the map was only conceptual. Martin agreed and told me not to become distracted by drafting errors. That answer bothered me. Martin was meticulous. He once delayed a closing because a bank had misspelled the name of a subsidiary on one page. Now he was dismissing a property boundary as decoration. I asked for the complete term sheet. Jason said it was still being revised. 2 days later, when I requested it again, he accused me of searching for reasons to reject anything he brought forward. The invitation to the anniversary dinner arrived shortly afterward. Jason described it as a family celebration before the company made a public transition announcement. He reserved a private room at a downtown restaurant where Susan and I had celebrated our 30th wedding anniversary. I assumed the location was meant to soften me. When I arrived, Jason, Lauren, and Martin were already seated. A bottle of expensive Cabernet was open, and a leather folder rested beside my plate. There were no photographs, no employees, and no anniversary card. Martin raised his glass and spoke about continuity. Jason thanked me for building a foundation he could carry forward. Lauren smiled, but her fingers kept tapping against the table. Before the appetizers arrived, Jason pushed the folder toward me. "We thought tonight should mark the official handoff," he said. I opened it expecting a ceremonial letter or a simple retirement resolution. Instead, I found more than 40 pages of legal documents, signature tabs, and attached schedules. The first page described my resignation as chairman. The next granted Jason an irrevocable voting proxy for 5 years. By page 12, I understood that this was not a transition ceremony. It was a closing. I read slowly while the three of them watched me. The documents transferred 30% of my shares to Jason. Authorized new borrowing. and named him the sole executive with power to negotiate the Northline transaction. A personal guarantee required my signature for the $1.6 million credit line. Another schedule pledged the workshop, equipment, receivables, and a parcel identified by the same legal description used in the family trust. I looked at Martin. This includes my house. He gave a patient smile that felt rehearsed. Only the adjacent commercial portion. The final survey will clarify it. I asked whether Margaret had reviewed the papers. Jason answered before Martin could. Margaret represents you, not the future of the company. I closed the folder and said I would not sign anything until she examined every page. Lauren's chair scraped against the floor. She said they had spent weeks negotiating and that delay could cost the company its financing. Jason told me the bank required execution by Monday morning. I asked why no one had mentioned a deadline. He replied, because every time we give you information, you turn it into another excuse to keep control. The conversation might still have ended without disaster if I had remained silent. Instead, I looked at Jason and said, a responsible executive does not ask his chairman to sign 40 pages over dinner. It was true, but I said it like a verdict, not advice. Jason's face reddened. He accused me of humiliating him in front of Martin and Lauren. Though all four of us were alone, he listed every promotion I had delayed, every decision I had reversed, and every time I had introduced him as my boy to clients. Some of those memories embarrassed me because they were accurate. Then he placed both hands on the table and said, you're being selfish. You'd rather watch this company die than let me lead it. I told him the company was not dying and asked who had convinced him otherwise. Martin lowered his eyes. Lauren stood so abruptly that the waiter outside opened the door. You don't care if Jason fails, she said. You need him to fail so you can remain important. I turned toward her, and that was when she threw the wine. The glass itself stayed in her hand, but the contents struck my face and soaked the signature pages in red. For several seconds, nobody moved. Wine ran from my eyebrow to my collar and dripped onto the tablecloth. Jason looked shocked, but he did not defend me or ask Lauren to leave. He only said her name softly, as though she were the person who had been injured. I took off my glasses and wiped them with my napkin. My hands were steady, which seemed to unsettle them more than anger would have. Martin suggested we all calm down. I asked him whether the bank had already received these documents. He said nothing. Lauren answered instead, call your lawyer. It won't matter. The bank already recognizes Jason as the person in control. Jason turned toward her and said, Lauren, stop. That reaction told me she had revealed something he wanted hidden. I did not demand an explanation. I took out my phone and wrote to Margaret, stop every transfer. Lock the trust. Start an independent audit tonight. She replied less than a minute later, do not sign. Do not discuss this further. Photograph every page. I began taking pictures while Jason watched, his anger giving way to fear. Martin reached for the folder, but I placed my hand on it and said, these were presented to me. They leave with me. I walked out of the restaurant, carrying the stained documents in a paper bag supplied by the manager. Nobody followed me. In the parking garage, I sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. My shirt smelled like wine, and the cold fabric clung to my chest. I remembered Jason at 10 years old, running through my first workshop with safety goggles too large for his face. I remembered teaching him to measure walnut boards twice before cutting them once. I had always believed mistakes could be corrected if you caught them early. That night, I could not tell whether my son had made a mistake or chosen a side. Margaret called and asked me to read the titles of every document. When I reached the corporate resolution authorizing Jason to communicate with lenders, she interrupted. There has been no valid board vote granting that authority, she said. I told her Lauren claimed the bank already recognized him. Margaret went quiet. Then she instructed me to drive directly to her office. It was nearly 9 in the evening, but the lights were on when I arrived. She met me at the door in jeans, a navy sweater, and the expression she wore when bad news required discipline. Margaret spread the damp pages across her conference table and photographed each signature tab. She confirmed that the trust property could not legally be pledged without both trustees approving it. And she had approved nothing. She called the bank's emergency counsel, notified them of a disputed authority, and demanded that all pending transactions be suspended. While she worked, I tried logging into my company email. My password failed. I tried the employee portal and received a notice that my credentials had been temporarily restricted by the administrator. A message then appeared on my personal phone from a local business reporter, asking whether health concerns had forced my immediate retirement. Attached was a draft press release, announcing Jason as chief executive and praising my decision to step aside fully in the interest of stability. I had never seen it. Margaret read the release twice and told me not to respond. "They are building a story," she said. "If you sound angry, they will use it." I asked who they meant. She looked at Martin's name on the signature page and answered, "Until we know more. Assume anyone with access to these records may be involved." Near midnight, the bank's attorney sent Margaret a scanned package supporting Jason's authority. It contained the limited power of attorney I had signed 18 months earlier before heart surgery. That document allowed Jason to approve payroll, essential vendors, and existing customer contracts if I became temporarily unavailable. It did not authorize him to transfer shares, borrow new money, or pledge real estate. Yet behind it was a board resolution claiming that I had personally expanded his authority and approved the Northline financing. My signature appeared at the bottom beside Martin's and Jason's. For a moment, I wondered whether I had signed something during recovery and forgotten. The thought frightened me more than I wanted Margaret to see. She examined the signature under a magnifying lamp and asked whether I recognized the date. I did. March 14. The morning after surgeons repaired a blocked artery. According to my medical records, I had been in intensive care, medicated, and unable to receive visitors except Susan's sister. Margaret turned the page toward me. The signature looked almost perfect, but the final stroke curved upward. Mine always ended flat. Someone had copied my name, attached it to a meeting that never happened, and presented it to a bank as proof that my son controlled everything I had built. By 8 the next morning, the wine on my shirt had dried into the color of an old bruise, but the forged signature remained bright on the conference table under Margaret's lamp. Neither of us had slept. She had spent the night notifying the bank, the trust's title insurer, and the company's outside counsel that Jason's authority was disputed. I spent it replaying Lauren's words the bank already recognizes Jason. Margaret warned me not to accuse anyone publicly until we knew how the resolution had been created. "Forgery is a conclusion," she said. "Right now, we have a document you deny signing, dated while you were in intensive care." I asked whether I should call Jason. She shook her head. "They expect you to explode. Don't give them a recording they can play for a judge." That suggestion sounded paranoid until my phone displayed 6 missed calls from Jason, followed by a message saying he was worried about my emotional state. The wording did not sound like my son. It sounded like evidence being prepared. I drove to the workshop shortly after 9, partly because it was my company and partly because staying away would make their announcement look true. The building had the same brick walls, loading docks, and sawdust smell it had carried for decades. But my key card flashed red at the employee entrance. I tried again, slower this time, as though the machine might recognize patience. It flashed red once more. Through the glass, I saw 2 office employees glance toward me and then quickly look away. Jason appeared after several minutes, opened the door manually, and said, "You should have called." I asked why my credentials had been disabled. He claimed the information technology team had temporarily restricted senior accounts because of the leadership transition. "There is no transition," I said. Jason looked past me toward the parking lot, where several employees were watching. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," he replied quietly. "You show up unannounced, agitated, demanding control." I realized then that every ordinary act could be reframed as proof that I was unstable. He led me to the main conference room instead of my office. Lauren sat at the table with a legal pad, although she had never attended an operations meeting in her life. Martin stood near the windows, holding a mug and wearing the grave expression of a family friend, forced into an unpleasant duty. Jason closed the door and asked whether I had taken my heart medication. I answered that my cardiologist had not appointed him to supervise me. Lauren wrote something down. I asked why she was taking notes. "Because conversations with you keep changing afterward," she said. I placed a copy of the forged resolution on the table and asked who had sent it to the bank. Martin glanced at Jason before answering that the bank had received a complete authority package from corporate files. I pointed to my signature and said I had been unconscious on the date shown. Lauren leaned back and replied, "You signed a lot of things before and after surgery. Not remembering every page doesn't make it fraudulent." Jason did not meet my eyes when she said it. I asked Jason directly whether he had attended the board meeting described in the resolution. He rubbed his thumb against the edge of the table, a habit he had carried since childhood, whenever he was trying to avoid a lie. "Dad, this isn't productive," he said. "The issue is whether the company survives your refusal to act." Martin opened a folder and presented another cash flow forecast showing a severe shortage within 7 weeks. He warned that suppliers might cut us off and that Northline's financing was the only realistic solution. I asked why receivables from the Ridgemont Hotel project were missing. Martin replied that the client had disputed final installation charges. I had spoken to Ridgemont's owner 3 days earlier. He had praised the work and promised payment by month's end. When I said so, Martin told me verbal promises were not bankable. Jason slid the report toward me and said, "This is what you refuse to understand. The numbers might have been manipulated." But his fear was real. That made him more dangerous, not less. Lauren then shifted the conversation from business to my health. She mentioned that I had forgotten Emma's school recital the previous spring, confused 2 project managers' names at a Christmas dinner, and once left my reading glasses in the company refrigerator. I stared at her until she stopped. The recital had occurred during Susan's memorial service. The managers were brothers who resembled each other, and the glasses incident had become a family joke because I had placed them beside a pie. Ordinary lapses were being assembled into a portrait of decline. Jason said, "Nobody is saying you're incompetent." Martin lowered his eyes again. Lauren was less careful. "We're saying you may not recognize your limitations." She told me that if I continued blocking the financing, they would ask the probate court to appoint a temporary conservator over my business interests. Then she added, "And until this settles down, Emma should not be around this kind of conflict." The threat was dressed as concern, but I heard it clearly. My granddaughter had become another asset they believed they could withhold. I wanted to pound the table and demand that Jason remember who had paid his tuition, financed his shares, and given his family a home. The words rose in my throat with enough force to make my chest tighten. Then I saw Lauren's phone lying face up beside her notebook, its recording symbol glowing red. I let the anger pass without feeding it. "I understand your position," I said. Jason looked surprised. I gathered my copy of the resolution and stood. "You believe I'm impaired. The company is failing, and the only responsible solution is for me to surrender control immediately." Martin said that was an unfair characterization. "It is an accurate one," I replied. I wished them a productive morning and walked out before anyone could stop me. At the entrance, the receptionist, a woman named Carla, who had worked for me for 19 years, pretended to organize mail while tears filled her eyes. I did not comfort her because cameras covered the lobby. I simply thanked her for her years of good work, which probably sounded like farewell. The consequences spread faster than the truth. By noon, the Columbus Business Ledger published a short article announcing that health concerns had accelerated my retirement. The piece quoted an unnamed company source claiming recent delays had threatened customer confidence. A longtime client called Margaret rather than me and asked whether Whitaker Millworks was headed for bankruptcy. Another customer postponed signing a $2 million contract until leadership stabilized. The bank froze our discretionary credit line because it had received conflicting instructions from Jason and Margaret. That freeze did not stop payroll, but it gave Martin new evidence that my intervention was harming the company. Jason sent a company-wide email saying he regretted that personal disagreements had become public and promised to protect employees from disruption. I read the message twice. It was calm, polished, and devastating to anyone without the forged resolution in front of them. Jason looked like a responsible executive managing an aging founder who refused to let go. Margaret persuaded me to return home and let her control communication. The silence there felt heavier than usual. Susan's mug still sat on the highest kitchen shelf because I had never been able to move it. I made coffee, opened my personal laptop, and began listing every decision Jason had made under the limited power of attorney after my surgery. The authorization had lasted 30 days. During that period, he could approve wages, essential vendors, and existing contracts. He could not borrow new money, issue shares, alter the trust, or pledge property. Margaret obtained the original document from her archives and compared it line by line with the version sent to the bank. The language had not been changed, but someone had attached the false board resolution behind it, creating the impression that my temporary authorization had later been expanded. The resolution also claimed that Martin and Jason had met with me at the hospital at 10 in the morning. My medical chart showed I had been intubated until nearly noon. This was no misunderstanding. Someone had constructed a paper trail around my incapacity. Late that afternoon, Margaret introduced me to Denise Parker, a forensic accountant with close-cropped gray hair and the habit of letting silence pressure people into revealing more than questions did. Denise asked for bank statements, vendor ledgers, payroll reports, accounts receivable aging schedules, and Martin's monthly forecasts going back 5 years. I told her Martin controlled most of those files. She asked what I personally reviewed. I admitted I focused on production, sales, and major contracts, while trusting him to manage cash, taxes, and vendor verification. Denise did not criticize me, which made the admission feel worse. Fraud rarely begins with a dramatic theft, she said. It begins with one person being trusted to approve, record, and explain the same transaction. Margaret arranged legal access to cloud backups maintained by an outside provider. Denise began comparing Martin's forecasts with actual customer payments. Within hours, she found that several receivables labeled doubtful had already been collected, but were being held in an account excluded from the reports shown to Jason. The discovery did not prove theft, but it proved the crisis had been exaggerated. Denise found more irregularities in material costs. Walnut, white oak, and brass hardware appeared to have been purchased twice for certain projects. Once from our established suppliers, and again through a company called Hale Ridge Supply. I recognized the name vaguely. Martin had once described it as a specialty broker, used when ordinary distributors could not meet deadlines. Denise searched Ohio business records and learned that Hale Ridge operated from a commercial mailbox in Dublin, had no warehouse, no listed employees, and no freight registrations. Over 4 years, Whitaker Millworks had paid it more than $900,000. Every invoice had been approved by Martin. Several carried descriptions copied almost word for word from legitimate vendor invoices. The amounts were not identical. They were increased by enough to look like rush order premiums. Denise tapped one line with her pencil. "This company may have supplied something," she said, "but it did not supply what your records claim." The words brought back a conversation with Susan from 5 years earlier. She had been sitting at the kitchen island with reading glasses low on her nose and 2 invoices spread before her. Although she never held an official position, Susan occasionally helped prepare documents for our annual insurance review. She had asked why we paid twice for the same shipment of walnut used at the Carrington residence. One invoice came from our regular distributor. The other came from Hale Ridge. I remembered laughing and telling her Martin probably had a reason. Susan had not laughed. "Trusting someone isn't the same as checking their work," she said. I answered that Martin had helped save the company during the recession and deserved better than suspicion over one duplicated description. The conversation ended when Jason arrived with Emma, and I never raised the issue again. Now Denise was staring at dozens of similar transactions. I had not merely missed a warning. I had dismissed it because accepting Susan's concern would have required me to question a friendship tied to my identity as a good judge of character. That evening, Lauren came to my house alone. She entered without knocking because Jason's family had always been treated as welcome, though the cottage they lived in stood a half-mile away. She wore no makeup and looked as if she had been crying. For a moment, I wondered whether she had come to apologize. Instead, she placed a prepared letter on the kitchen table and asked me to sign a temporary consent, allowing Jason to negotiate with Northline while the dispute was resolved. I asked about the wine. She closed her eyes and said, "I lost control, and I shouldn't have done it." The apology lasted 1 sentence. Then she told me my stubbornness had pushed everyone beyond reason. She said her company owed approximately $280,000, and that a lender could begin collection within weeks. If Northline closes, Jason can stabilize Whitaker, and we can stabilize our family, she said. I asked how a loan to my company would pay her private debt. Her face changed so quickly that I knew I had touched something important. Lauren said she had misspoken. According to her new explanation, Jason's increased compensation would allow them to refinance her obligations. I asked whether Jason knew the full amount. She picked up the consent letter and told me the exact number was irrelevant. I reminded her that Whitaker Contracts had kept her business alive twice already. And you made sure everyone knew it. She replied. Her voice broke, but not from shame. Every favor from you comes with a plaque attached. I could not deny that I had mentioned my help during arguments. She accused me of enjoying their dependence because it allowed me to overrule Jason. Then she said, sign the agreement, or you may lose more than the company. I asked whether she meant Emma. Lauren looked toward the window instead of answering. When she left, she forgot one page of the proposed consent. At the bottom, in small print, was a reference to a restructuring fee that would be paid to satisfy designated affiliate obligations. Denise later told me such wording could conceal almost anything. The next morning, Jason called and informed me that their attorney was preparing a petition for temporary guardianship over my financial affairs. He sounded exhausted rather than triumphant. You're forcing this, he said. I asked whether he believed I lacked the mental capacity to manage my life. He hesitated, then answered, I believe you're making dangerous decisions because you can't accept change. I told him disagreement was not incapacity. Jason replied that judges considered patterns, not single incidents, and began listing the same examples Lauren had recorded in the conference room. I realized they had been collecting stories for some time. Before hanging up, he said, you can stop all of this by signing. That sentence ended whatever hope remained that the legal threat was merely defensive. He was using the possibility of declaring his father incompetent as leverage in a business negotiation. I wanted to tell him how deeply that wounded me, but emotional honesty had never been easy between us. Instead, I said, be certain the documents you file are true. His answer was barely audible. You should have trusted me sooner. Denise worked through the weekend. By Sunday afternoon, she had traced Hale Ridge Supply's registration to Martin's younger sister, Evelyn Hale Mercer, a retired dental receptionist living in Arizona. Evelyn appeared to have no involvement beyond lending her name. The company's bank account received payments from Whitaker, retained small amounts, and transferred most of the money to an entity called Briar Summit Development. Margaret searched state records and found that Briar Summit was managed through layered limited liability companies connected to Northline's Real Estate Council. The same investment group offering to rescue our business had received money originating from inflated vendor payments approved by Martin. Denise cautioned that ownership structures could be misleading. But the pattern was unmistakable. Funds had left Whitaker through a questionable supplier and flowed toward people positioned to buy our land at a distressed price. Someone had not simply taken advantage of a financial crisis. Someone had manufactured one, weakened the company's reported position, frightened Jason, and prepared a sale that could erase the trail. Margaret placed the records beside Susan's old invoices and said, Robert, this did not begin with the papers at dinner. That dinner was the final step. Margaret did not tell me about Susan's envelope until Monday morning. She waited until Denise had confirmed the connection between Hale Ridge and the Northline network, then unlocked a fireproof cabinet in her office and removed a cream-colored envelope sealed with blue wax. Susan's handwriting crossed the front, for Robert. Only if someone tries to change ownership of the company or the family trust without his full consent. I recognized the careful curve of every letter. Margaret explained that Susan had given it to her 7 months before she died, along with written instructions defining the conditions under which it could be opened. I felt a sharp mixture of gratitude and shame. My wife had anticipated a danger I had dismissed while she was alive. Did she tell you what was inside? I asked. Margaret said no. She only said you might refuse to see the truth if it arrived as an accusation. She hoped you would see it if it arrived as a warning. I broke the seal with my thumb and unfolded a letter that began, Robert, trusting people is one of your strengths, but pride can turn it into blindness. Susan's letter was only 2 pages, yet I had to stop several times because her voice seemed to rise from the paper. She wrote that she had noticed irregular invoices during insurance reviews and had questioned Martin privately. According to her, he explained each discrepancy smoothly, but became defensive when she asked for shipping records. She had copied 6 invoices involving Hale Ridge Supply, along with 2 legitimate invoices that appeared to describe the same materials. She also included a small brass key taped beneath the final paragraph. The key belonged to a safe deposit box at a bank near our old home. Susan warned that what she had preserved might not prove a crime, but it could show where to look. Her last lines hurt most. "I know you believe loyalty means defending the people who stood beside you. Sometimes loyalty means protecting what they helped you build from the worst thing they may become." I had defended Martin because admitting she might be right would have meant admitting I had placed friendship above oversight. Now her careful preparation was protecting me from the consequences of my arrogance. Margaret and I went to the bank that afternoon. The box contained no dramatic confession, no hidden ledger, and no neatly packaged solution. Susan had left copies of vendor statements, handwritten notes, and an email printed from an old company account. In that email, Martin instructed a junior bookkeeper to replace the name of our regular walnut supplier with Hale Ridge on a payment record because the original coding was creating confusion for the auditors. The message was 5 years old. The bookkeeper had replied that the shipment number already appeared under another vendor. Martin told her to make the change and stop copying Robert on routine corrections. I remembered the employee, a quiet young woman named Melissa Grant, who resigned several months later without explanation. At the time, Martin told me she lacked attention to detail. Susan had written Melissa's personal email address in the margin, along with the words. She looked frightened when I asked. Denise said the records were useful but still incomplete. We needed proof of where the money went, how the false crisis had been constructed, and who knowingly participated in the proposed sale. Melissa agreed to speak with us by video call from North Carolina, where she now worked for a regional hospital system. She looked nervous even after Margaret assured her that she was not being accused of anything. Melissa said Martin had instructed her to split legitimate invoices, change vendor names, and backdate approvals. When she questioned him, he warned that challenging the chief financial officer would end her career. She saved several emails but deleted them after leaving because she feared being sued. Susan had approached her in the parking lot shortly before the resignation and asked whether Martin was pressuring her. Melissa denied it then because she was ashamed and afraid. She could not provide the missing records now, but she confirmed that Hale Ridge never supplied shipping documents, warehouse receipts, or freight bills. More importantly, she remembered Martin discussing cleaning the company before the land event during a phone call. At the time, she assumed he meant organizing accounts before an appraisal. Denise believed the phrase referred to removing questionable balances before a sale. The testimony gave us direction, but Margaret warned that memory alone would not defeat forged corporate documents and a guardianship petition supported by my own son. Denise next examined the Northline proposal beside Martin's internal forecasts. The deeper she went, the less the transaction resembled financing. Under the final structure, Whitaker Millworks would borrow $1.6 million, but nearly $400,000 would be paid immediately as restructuring, consulting, and placement fees. Another portion would purchase what the documents called affiliate obligations. Lauren's company was not named, yet a schedule listed a debt amount of exactly $280. Ling, ling, ling. The figure she had admitted in my kitchen. Northline would gain an option to purchase the workshop property if we violated any financial covenant, including a requirement based on the artificially reduced earnings Martin had reported. In other words, the loan was designed to place us in default. Jason would receive increased voting power. Lauren's debt would disappear, and Martin's network would acquire valuable land after the company failed a test based on numbers he controlled. I had assumed Jason wanted the company badly enough to steal it from me. The documents suggested something more complicated. He was being offered a crown inside a building already wired to collapse. Margaret obtained a draft site agreement through the company's cloud backup. It had been created on Martin's computer and circulated to Jason and Lauren 6 weeks before the anniversary dinner. The agreement promised Jason 35% ownership in a successor company after Northline acquired Whitaker's operating assets. It also guaranteed payment of Lauren's business debt and appointed Martin as a transition consultant entitled to a substantial fee. Yet buried near the end was a clause allowing Northline to remove Jason if profitability targets were missed. Since the targets depended on manipulated figures, he could have been forced out within months. When I read the file, my first reaction was relief. I wanted to believe my son had been deceived completely. Then Denise showed me the comment history. Jason had asked whether the false board resolution could be ratified after closing. Lauren had written that the trust property must remain in the collateral package because Robert will never cooperate if he knows the house is protected. They may not have understood Martin's theft, but they understood that key documents were false. Fear had opened the door. Ambition had persuaded them to walk through it. The truth changed the shape of the betrayal without reducing its weight. Martin had shown Jason financial reports designed to create panic. He told him customers were leaving. Payroll was at risk, and I was secretly planning to sell the company to outsiders who would remove him. Lauren, already facing the collapse of her design business, accepted Martin's promise that one decisive transfer could protect their home, marriage, and daughter. They convinced themselves they were rescuing what I was too old and stubborn to save. But rescue did not require forging a meeting, threatening guardianship, or placing my home at risk without my knowledge. They chose those methods because the methods benefited them. I sat alone in Margaret's conference room after everyone left and remembered every time I had told Jason he was not ready. I had never given him a written path to readiness. I had kept authority vague, corrected him publicly, and treated succession as a privilege I could postpone indefinitely. Martin had exploited resentment I helped create. That made me responsible for the weakness in our family, but not for the choices made through it. The following morning, I asked Margaret whether we could stop the sale immediately. She said yes, but doing so might preserve Martin's ability to claim the irregularities were bookkeeping mistakes unrelated to the proposed transaction. The bank had paused lending, yet Northline had not formally withdrawn. Martin still believed he could repair the documents, pressure me into signing, or persuade a court to shift control to Jason. Denise suggested we let him continue long enough to reveal the full structure. I disliked the idea of allowing a threat to remain active, but an immediate public accusation could split employees, frighten customers, and give Martin time to destroy records. We needed him to confirm the connection between the false cash crisis, Hale Ridge, and the land purchase in front of parties he could not easily manipulate. I proposed pretending to reconsider the transition. Margaret raised one eyebrow. You would have to let Jason believe the guardianship threat worked. I told her that pride had already cost me enough. If appearing defeated protected the company, I could endure it. For the first time since the dinner, I stopped reacting and began planning. The plan depended on a formal closing session. I would tell Jason that I was willing to discuss retirement if every term were presented clearly before representatives from the bank, Northline, our shareholders, and independent counsel. Martin would see the meeting as his opportunity to legitimize the earlier documents. We would request a final data room containing financial forecasts, ownership schedules, collateral descriptions, side agreements, and lender communications. Each participant would receive versions marked through document metadata, so Denise could track downloads and alterations. Margaret would not reveal Susan's records or the full forensic findings. We would allow Martin to believe the audit had found only ordinary inconsistencies. If he revised the reports, removed the side agreement, or misrepresented the trust property again, the changes would demonstrate intent. Jason would also face a choice. If he corrected the record, he might limit the damage. If he repeated the false claims, he would remove any argument that he had acted innocently. I hated turning a family conflict into a controlled test. But Jason had already replaced trust with paperwork. Paperwork would now tell me which son was left beneath his fear. Before we could set the trap, a sheriff's deputy arrived at my home with a thick envelope. Jason and Lauren had filed a petition in Franklin County Probate Court, seeking temporary control over my financial affairs. The petition described me as confused, impulsive, and increasingly unable to understand complex transactions. It cited my heart surgery, forgotten appointments, the incident at the restaurant, and my decision to freeze company financing. Attached was an edited video recorded by Lauren. It began after the wine hit me and showed me standing with one hand pressed against the table while Jason said, "Dad, calm down." The video omitted Lauren throwing the drink and ended before I quietly collected the documents. A medical note from my cardiologist was included as well. The doctor had advised me after surgery to reduce stress and avoid major decisions. Their filing presented that old recommendation as current evidence that I lacked judgment. Reading my son's sworn statement felt worse than seeing the forged signature. A stranger might falsify my name for money. Jason had turned private memories into weapons and called it concern. Margaret moved quickly, scheduling an independent capacity evaluation with a geriatric physician and a neuropsychologist. The examinations took nearly an entire day. I answered questions about dates, assets, contracts, family relationships, and hypothetical financial decisions. I repeated lists of words, interpreted legal scenarios, solved pattern problems, and explained the difference between my personal property, company property, and trust assets. The doctor asked why I opposed the Northline transaction. I described the financing terms, the false resolution, the vendor irregularities, and the conflict involving Martin. He asked whether I hated my son. I answered that I loved Jason but did not trust him. Saying those words aloud made them permanent in a way private thoughts had not. The preliminary findings showed no cognitive impairment. My memory and executive function were normal for my age, and my understanding of the disputed assets was unusually detailed. Margaret filed the results immediately and requested dismissal of the petition. She warned me, however, that courts often preserve temporary restrictions until both sides can be heard, especially when multiple family members allege urgent financial risk. Jason called that evening. His voice sounded strained, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he said the guardianship petition was not meant to punish me. I asked whether he had read the sworn declaration before signing it. He said Lauren's attorney prepared the language based on their concerns. I repeated the question. After a long pause, he admitted he had read it. Then you swore your father couldn't understand his own company. I said. Jason replied that I was ignoring professional advice and endangering 52 jobs. I asked whether he knew Hale Ridge Supply was connected to Martin's family. His silence lasted only 2 seconds, but it was enough. Martin explained that, he said, it's a sourcing affiliate. I asked whether he had verified the explanation. He accused me of trying to distract him from the financing. I could hear someone whispering near him. Probably Lauren. Before hanging up, Jason said, when this is over, I hope you remember I was trying to save what you built. I answered, I hope you remember what you were willing to destroy to own it. 2 days later, the probate judge held an emergency hearing by video. Margaret presented the capacity reports, hospital records, trust documents, and the limited power of attorney. Jason's attorney argued that the conflict itself demonstrated my inability to act objectively and warned that I might transfer shares or assets to punish my family before a full hearing. The judge rejected their request for a guardian with broad control, stating that the medical evidence did not establish incapacity. For one brief moment, I believed the danger had passed. Then, she imposed a narrower temporary order. Until a formal hearing, I could not sell, gift, or substantially alter my ownership interests. Nor could I change the beneficiaries of the family trust. Ordinary business decisions remained possible, but extraordinary transactions required notice. The order protected me from being removed, yet it also prevented me from using my shares to restructure control or trigger a rapid buyback of Martin's stake. Margaret called it a partial victory. I saw the timing. Northline's proposed closing remained only 10 days away, and Martin now knew exactly how long he had to force a signature. That afternoon, Martin circulated a revised closing calendar. He scheduled the final transaction meeting for the last business day before our formal probate hearing, claiming the company could not survive another delay. Northline confirmed it would send representatives. The bank agreed to attend without promising funding. Jason emailed me a carefully worded invitation, saying he hoped we could resolve our differences as a family before outside circumstances decided the company's future. Attached were updated financial projections showing an even worse cash position than before. Denise compared them with the underlying records and found that Martin had removed 2 incoming customer payments totaling nearly $700,000. He was no longer merely defending old numbers. He was actively deepening the illusion of collapse. Margaret asked whether I still wanted to proceed with the plan. I looked at Susan's letter, the court order, and the closing notice bearing my son's name. Yes, I said. Let them believe they have 10 days to take everything. What I did not yet know was whether Jason would use those 10 days to step away from Martin or help him finish the job. The first thing I did after agreeing to proceed with the closing was nothing. For 2 full days, I did not call Jason, challenge Martin's projections, or issue another public statement. Silence was more difficult than anger, because silence left room for imagination. And I wanted them imagining surrender. Margaret handled every legal communication while Denise prepared the electronic data room. Each person involved in the transaction received access to documents that looked identical but contained invisible tracking markers and slight differences in formatting. If a page was downloaded, altered, forwarded, or printed, we would know which account had touched it. The data room included the legitimate trust agreement, the actual customer receivables schedule, Martin's latest forecast, and the proposed side agreement paying Lauren's debt. We did not hide anything false inside it. The trap depended on their choices, not ours. Margaret warned me that evidence gathered through ordinary business access could still be attacked if we appeared to provoke misconduct. Then we won't provoke anything, I said. We'll give them the truth and see what they do to it. For 38 years, I had judged wood by how it responded under pressure. Now I would learn what pressure revealed about my family. I called Jason on the 3rd morning and told him I wanted peace. He answered cautiously, as if expecting a trick. I said the court fight, frozen financing, and public embarrassment had exhausted me. And perhaps I had confused protecting the company with preserving my own importance. None of that was entirely false. Jason's voice softened for the first time since the restaurant. I never wanted it to get this far, he said. I replied that I would attend the closing and consider signing if every party explained the transaction openly. I requested the bank, Northline representatives, shareholders, legal counsel, and senior managers be present because I did not want rumors afterward. Jason agreed too quickly. He told me Martin would coordinate the details. Before hanging up, he said, "Thank you for finally trusting me." The words landed harder than I expected. I almost told him trust was precisely what he had destroyed. But that would have warned him. Instead, I said, "I'm trusting the process." After the call, Margaret asked whether I could maintain the appearance of cooperation for another week. I told her I had spent years pretending my marriage was fine while Susan was dying because she needed normal mornings. I could pretend to be defeated for 7 days. Martin responded exactly as Denise predicted. Within 4 hours of receiving access to the data room, he downloaded the actual receivables report, showing 2 large payments due before month's end. The marked file assigned to his account later appeared in an email to Northline, with both payments removed and several collection dates delayed. He also changed a profitability projection, so the company would appear likely to violate Northline's loan covenant within the 1st quarter. Denise watched the alterations populate across the tracking system and said, "He is building the default before the loan exists." Martin then uploaded his revised report as if it were the official version and sent Jason a message explaining that I had provided outdated internal numbers. Jason replied that he would use Martin's version at the closing. That response hurt because it showed my son was no longer simply relying on someone else's expertise. He had been shown conflicting records and chose the one that supported taking control. Still, he did not yet know the figures were connected to theft. I reminded myself that the closing would offer him one final opportunity to ask why the truth kept changing. Lauren accessed the trust documents late that night from the cottage. The version assigned to her contained a unique spacing pattern on the legal description page. Less than an hour later, her attorney emailed Martin a draft collateral schedule containing the same pattern, proving the trust language had been copied directly from her access. The attorney warned that the property could not be pledged without Margaret's consent. Lauren replied, "Find a structure where the house stays in the package until after Robert signs. Once funding occurs, Margaret won't risk undoing everything." She also wrote that my emotional attachment to the house was the only leverage he understands. Denise read the message aloud in Margaret's office. I stared through the window at traffic moving below and remembered Lauren bringing Emma to Susan's garden each spring. She had sat at my kitchen table, accepted my contracts, celebrated holidays under my roof, and still treated the house as a pressure point. Yet her motive was not simple greed. Her company's lender had issued a final demand, and she believed losing financial security would repeat the disaster of her childhood. Fear explained the urgency. It did not excuse turning my home into collateral without my consent. The conflict spread beyond our family as Martin accelerated preparations. 3 senior craftsmen submitted resignation notices after hearing Northline planned to consolidate production. A hotel developer demanded written assurance that our warranties would survive any asset sale. Carla, the receptionist, called Margaret privately and reported that employees had been instructed not to discuss the transition with me. Even suppliers began requesting earlier payment because rumors of bankruptcy had reached them. Jason sent another reassuring company-wide email, but the tone had changed. He blamed outside interference for uncertainty and promised the closing would restore stability. I recognized Martin's language in several sentences. The company I built around personal relationships had become a stage where every side communicated through lawyers, press statements, and carefully preserved messages. I wanted to walk into the workshop, gather everyone beneath the overhead cranes, and tell them the truth. Margaret refused. Not yet, she said. If employees panic, Martin will claim your disclosure destroyed value. Waiting felt like allowing a fire to burn while measuring the smoke. But we needed the person holding the match to believe the room remained empty. The hardest consequence came from Emma. She appeared at my back door on Saturday afternoon, wearing a purple bicycle helmet and trying not to cry. The cottage was close enough that she sometimes rode over alone. Though Jason and Lauren had recently stopped encouraging it, she asked whether I was moving away. I told her no. Then she asked whether her parents would own my house after the meeting. The question made my stomach turn. I sat beside her on the porch steps and asked why she believed that. Emma said she had heard Lauren tell Jason that once the documents were signed, the house problem would be solved and they could finally renovate it. She assumed they meant the cottage. When she asked, Lauren had told her that one day the main house would belong to their family. I explained that the house was protected in a trust for her future, but no one had the right to take it while I lived there. Emma frowned and said, Mom said you're keeping things from us because you're mad. I told her adults sometimes confused boundaries with anger. I did not criticize her parents. Children should not be recruited into adult wars, even when adults have already used them as ammunition. Jason arrived 20 minutes later. Furious that Emma had come over without permission, he accused me of discussing legal matters with an 11-year-old. I told him she had asked whether I was being removed from my own home. His anger shifted briefly toward embarrassment, then returned stronger. Lauren is under enormous pressure, he said. You keep treating everything she says like evidence. I asked whether he intended to live in my house after the closing. Jason said the property issue was temporary and that no one would force me out. I asked why the collateral schedule included the trust land. He insisted Martin had assured him it was necessary only to satisfy the lender. Do you hear yourself? I said. You are offering property you do not own because someone told you it would make the loan easier. Jason looked toward Emma, who stood inside the kitchen doorway. Lowering his voice, he said, You had decades to decide what happens next. You left everyone guessing. I admitted that was true. Then I told him uncertainty did not grant ownership. He took Emma's hand and left, but not before glancing back at the house as if he were finally seeing the boundary between inheritance and entitlement. That evening, Jason confronted Lauren about the side agreement. I learned the details because their argument occurred in the cottage office, while Lauren's laptop remained connected to the data room's secure meeting recorder. Denise had enabled logging for scheduled document sessions, and Lauren had forgotten to disconnect after speaking with her attorney. We heard no private domestic conversation unrelated to the transaction. The recording began when Jason opened the Northline agreement and asked why her $280,000 obligation appeared as an affiliate payment. Lauren admitted Martin had promised to clear the debt from the beginning. Jason said she had told him the financing would help only through his increased salary. She replied that he would never have acted if he knew how desperate the situation was. Then Jason asked whether she knew the trust property could not be pledged. Lauren said, I knew Margaret could block it, which is why we needed Robert's signature before she interfered. Jason answered, You let me accuse him of lying while you knew this. Lauren shot back that Jason had been waiting his entire life for someone to give him permission to defy his father. The silence afterward revealed more than either confession. Their marriage did not break that night, But something essential cracked. Jason slept at a hotel and missed the next morning's operations meeting. Martin contacted him repeatedly, first with concern and then with irritation. By afternoon, Jason requested copies of the original lender correspondence and the calculations supporting Martin's forecasts. Martin delayed, claiming the data was complex. Jason then asked why the successor company's ownership guarantee was conditional, while his personal loan guarantee was permanent. That question told me my son had begun reading beyond the promises made to him. Martin responded by warning that I was manipulating him and that hesitation could destroy their only opportunity. He wrote, "Your father is waiting for you to lose your nerve so he can prove you were never ready." It was cruel because it targeted the wound I had helped create. Jason did not answer for 3 hours. When he finally replied, he said he still intended to complete the closing, but wanted every ownership term confirmed in writing. Martin agreed. Denise looked at me and said, "He suspects something." I could not tell whether she meant Jason suspected Martin or Martin suspected our trap. Either possibility made the remaining days more dangerous. Martin confirmed our concern by trying to erase Hale Ridge. Bank alerts showed an attempted transfer from its account to an offshore financial service, followed by a second transfer to Briar Summit Development. The first was blocked for compliance review. The second succeeded before Margaret could obtain an emergency preservation order. We could not prove Martin personally initiated the transfers because Evelyn Mercer remained the registered account holder. But the timing showed someone knew the vendor trail was being examined. Martin also deleted folders from his company laptop and scheduled a flight to Phoenix for the morning after the closing. Denise recovered file indexes from the backup server. Yet several recent attachments were missing. Our plan had depended on Martin presenting the transaction. But he now had reasons to disappear. Margaret considered seeking an injunction and confronting him immediately. I argued that doing so would warn Northline and give Martin a chance to portray himself as an innocent officer fleeing family chaos. Instead, we informed the bank that no funding decision would be valid unless every shareholder and advisor attended the final meeting in person. Northline, already uneasy about conflicting documents, adopted the same condition. Martin could skip the closing, but his absence would collapse the deal he needed to complete. The following day, Martin appeared at my house without an appointment. He stood on the porch carrying no folder, which made the visit feel personal. He said we had been friends too long to let lawyers decide everything. I invited him into the kitchen but did not offer coffee. He spoke about the recession, the years we nearly missed payroll, and the sacrifices he had made to keep Whitaker alive. Much of it was true. Then he said Jason lacked my resilience and needed protection from his own mistakes. Northline is not perfect, Martin admitted, but it preserves the operating business. I asked what happened to the land. He said land was replaceable. I asked about Hale Ridge. His eyes moved towards Susan's empty chair before returning to me. Susan never understood procurement. He said. The contempt in his voice erased the last part of me that wanted to believe he had rationalized a few bad decisions. I told him the closing would proceed as scheduled. Martin studied my face and asked, "What exactly are you planning?" Robert I smiled faintly and said, "To listen carefully before I sign." He left without shaking my hand. Margaret arranged one final private meeting with Jason on the evening before the closing. He arrived alone and looked older than 39. I placed 4 documents on the table: the genuine receivables report, the Hale Ridge payment summary, the side agreement involving Lauren's debt, and his email acknowledging that no board meeting occurred on the date of the resolution. Jason read them without speaking. When he reached the email, he whispered, "I thought we could ratify it." I asked whether he understood that ratifying a decision later did not make a forged meeting real. He said Martin assured him family companies handled paperwork informally all the time. I asked whether he knew Martin's supplier had moved company money into the buyer's network. Jason said no, then asked whether I had proof. I told him enough to know the crisis was constructed, but not enough to protect him from his own signatures. "Tomorrow you will have a choice," I said. "You can repeat what Martin told you, or you can tell the truth about what you knew." Jason asked whether telling the truth would save his job. I answered, "No. It may save what is left of your name." He stood and paced the room, accusing me of setting a trap instead of coming to him sooner. I reminded him that he had locked me out, threatened my relationship with Emma, and sworn I could not manage my affairs. When exactly would you have believed me, I asked. Jason had no answer. I told him I was not offering immunity, forgiveness, or continued ownership. I was offering one honest decision before consequences arrived. He asked what would happen to Lauren. I said her choices belonged to her, just as his belonged to him. For the first time, Jason admitted he had wanted Martin's story to be true because it made his resentment feel righteous. He believed I planned to deny him control forever. And every false report confirmed what he already feared. I said, "That is how good lies work. They arrive shaped like something we already believe." Jason folded the documents but left them on the table. At the door, he asked whether I had ever truly intended for him to lead the company. I told him yes, but I had been too afraid of becoming unnecessary to say when. He nodded once and walked into the dark without telling me what he would do. The closing began the next morning in the company's main showroom. Surrounded by walnut paneling, our own craftsmen had installed. Northline sent 2 executives and outside counsel. The bank sent its senior commercial lender and compliance attorney. Margaret sat beside Denise at one end of the long table. Several department heads and minority stakeholders occupied chairs along the wall. Lauren arrived separately from Jason, wearing a cream suit and an expression so composed it looked painful. Martin entered last, carrying a leather briefcase and greeting everyone as though the meeting were a celebration. He avoided looking at Denise. Jason took his place across from me, pale and silent. On the table lay the final financing package, the revised collateral schedule, and the transfer documents stained only in my memory by red wine. Martin began with a polished speech about continuity, family legacy, and the courage required to embrace change. Then he opened the signature folder, rotated it toward me, and placed a silver pen beside my hand. "Robert," he said with a confident smile, "everyone here is waiting for one signature." I looked at the silver pen but did not touch it. "Before I sign," I said, "I want the financial condition of the company explained for everyone in this room." Martin's smile remained in place, though one corner of his mouth tightened. He opened the presentation displayed on the wall and described Whitaker Millworks as a respected but endangered business facing an immediate cash shortage. He said receivables were doubtful, suppliers were losing confidence, and Northline's financing represented our last practical chance to protect 52 jobs. Jason stared at the table. Lauren watched him rather than Martin. When the presentation ended, I asked Martin to state the available cash balance after payroll and identify the customer payments expected that month. He cited the figures from his revised forecast. Denise then stood and handed copies of the actual bank reconciliation to the lender, Northline's attorney, and every shareholder present. Those numbers exclude 2 confirmed payments totaling $684,000. She said. The room became still. Martin claimed the payments were uncertain. Denise displayed the deposit confirmations and asked why funds already received had been removed from his report. Martin answered with the confidence of a man accustomed to controlling which questions mattered. He said the payments were restricted by project obligations and therefore unavailable for operating expenses. Denise placed the underlying contracts on the screen and showed that no such restrictions existed. She then compared Martin's original forecast, the file he downloaded from the data room, and the version sent to Northline. The tracking marks proved his account had accessed the accurate document less than an hour before the altered one was distributed. "This is not a difference in accounting judgment," she said. "Customer payments were deleted, collection dates were changed, and material costs were inflated." Martin accused her of misunderstanding how specialized manufacturing companies managed working capital. The bank's compliance attorney interrupted and asked whether Martin personally authorized the changes. He answered that members of his finance team made routine adjustments. Denise displayed the editing history showing the revisions came from Martin's assigned computer. I watched his expression lose warmth, but not control. He turned toward Jason and said, "You reviewed these projections. Tell them the company was in danger." Jason lifted his eyes but did not speak. I asked Denise to continue. She introduced Hale Ridge Supply, the vendor that had received more than $930,000 from Whitaker over 4 years. She showed duplicate invoice descriptions, missing freight records, and payments approved solely by Martin. Then she traced the transfers from Hale Ridge into Briar Summit Development. an entity connected through corporate filings to Northline's real estate counsel. Northline's executives began whispering with their attorney. One of them stated that their investment committee had never been told company funds had flowed through an affiliated development entity. Martin said Briar Summit participated in numerous legitimate transactions, and that any connection was coincidental. Margaret placed Susan's preserved invoices beside the old email, instructing Melissa Grant to replace a legitimate supplier's name with Hale Ridge. She explained that the documents had existed for years and had led Denise toward the current records. Martin glanced at Susan's handwriting and said nothing. I remembered him standing beside me at her funeral, one hand on my shoulder while I thanked him for being family. The memory did not make me angry anymore. It made the betrayal precise. Martin recovered quickly. He argued that even if vendor controls had been imperfect, the issues had nothing to do with the authority transferring control to Jason. Margaret opened the corporate record book and displayed the limited power of attorney I signed before surgery. She read the clauses permitting Jason to approve payroll, essential vendors, and existing customer contracts for 30 days. Then she displayed the resolution claiming I had expanded those powers during a board meeting at the hospital. My medical records showed that I was intubated at the stated time, while visitor logs confirmed that neither Jason nor Martin entered the intensive care unit that morning. The signature ended with an upward stroke, unlike every verified signature I had given the bank. Margaret did not call it forgery. She asked Jason whether the meeting occurred. Martin immediately said the resolution merely memorialized earlier conversations. The bank's attorney asked Jason directly. My son looked at me, then at the document bearing my copied name. No, he said. There was no meeting that day. Martin leaned toward him and whispered, "Be careful." Jason answered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I've been careful for months. That's how I got here." Jason admitted that Martin told him the resolution could be ratified after the financing closed. He admitted reading the document, knowing the meeting description was false, and allowing it to be presented to the bank because he believed the company would collapse without immediate action. He said Martin had shown him reports claiming payroll was at risk and told him I was negotiating secretly to sell the business. I asked whether he verified those claims. Jason shook his head. "I wanted them to be true," he said. "They made every fight we ever had feel like proof." He acknowledged that resentment toward me had made him willing to accept shortcuts he would have rejected from anyone else. Then he turned toward Northline's representatives and explained that Martin promised him 35% ownership in the successor company. Northline's attorney requested the agreement. Margaret distributed the side letter recovered from the backup system. Jason pointed to the ownership clause and then to the provision allowing Northline to remove him if profitability targets were missed. "I did not understand that the targets were built from altered numbers," he said, "but I knew the board resolution was false. That part is on me." Martin's composure finally broke. He accused Jason of rewriting history to save himself and said Lauren had designed the pressure campaign from the beginning. Lauren stiffened but did not deny her involvement. Margaret presented the affiliate payment schedule listing exactly $280,000, matching the debt of Lauren's design company. She also displayed Lauren's email asking her attorney to keep my house in the collateral package until after I signed. The attorney's written warning that trust consent was required appeared directly above her reply. Lauren looked around the room and realized no explanation could erase her own words. "I was trying to keep my family from losing everything," she said. Her voice was steady, but tears filled her eyes. "I grew up watching a sheriff put our furniture on the curb. I promised myself my daughter would never see that. I told her fear did not give her ownership of another person's home." Lauren nodded once. "No," she said, "but by then, I had convinced myself your boundaries were punishment." Jason asked whether she had known Martin's reports were false. She said she knew only that he could make the debt disappear. That had been enough for her not to ask. The bank's senior lender closed the financing folder and announced that no loan would proceed while authority, collateral, and financial representations remained disputed. Northline's attorney withdrew the acquisition proposal pending an internal investigation. But one executive went further, stating that the investment committee had never approved the side agreement presented to Jason. Martin claimed the document was an early draft created for discussion. Denise displayed its metadata, showing Martin had revised it 3 days earlier and forwarded it to Northline's real estate counsel. The executive demanded a recess. Margaret objected. explaining that company records were at risk because Martin still held system access. The bank's compliance attorney contacted internal security, while our outside technology firm disabled Martin's credentials. He reached for his briefcase, but Margaret told him a preservation notice required all company devices and documents to remain. Martin laughed bitterly and asked whether I planned to have him arrested in the showroom. I plan to let the evidence go wherever it legally belongs, I said. It was not as dramatic as shouting, but the absence of mercy in my voice made him stop smiling. Margaret then explained the shareholder agreement Martin had signed 21 years earlier. Any shareholder who knowingly falsified corporate records, misappropriated funds, or acted to force a below-market transfer for personal benefit triggered the Bad Act repurchase provision. The company could buy back Martin's 15% interest at adjusted book value, reduced by documented losses subject to court review. That price would be far below what he expected from the Northline sale. We had not been able to invoke the provision while the probate restriction limited extraordinary ownership changes. But Jason's sworn admission, the document history, and the lender's findings allowed Margaret to request immediate judicial approval rather than rely on my unilateral decision. She had already prepared the motion using evidence developed before the meeting. The company would also file a civil action seeking recovery of the Hale Ridge payments, costs caused by lost contracts, and damages arising from the false financing package. The bank announced it would refer the disputed resolution and transaction records to appropriate investigators. Martin's greatest protection had been his reputation as the steady man behind my success. By the time he left the room with counsel, that reputation belonged to the evidence. The meeting did not end with applause. Real life rarely offers applause when a family breaks in public. Department heads sat in stunned silence, embarrassed to have witnessed private failures that had endangered their jobs. Northline's representatives departed through a side entrance. The bank retained copies of every relevant record. Martin's briefcase remained sealed in the conference room until counsel documented its contents. Jason stood near the window, looking down at the production floor where employees continued building staircases because most of them did not yet know what had happened upstairs. I told him he was removed as director of operations effective immediately. His access would be restricted, and an independent committee would review every decision he made under the disputed authority. He asked whether his cooperation changed anything. I said it changed how I would describe his actions, but not the consequences. You told the truth when the lie stopped protecting you. I said, that matters. But it is not the same as telling it when the lie first began. Jason accepted the letter without arguing. For once, neither of us used anger to avoid shame. Lauren's consequences arrived more slowly, but no less certainly. Whitaker terminated all contracts with her design company, and Denise identified payments that had been accelerated or approved without supporting work. Lauren agreed to a repayment schedule secured by her remaining business assets. If she failed to comply, the company retained the right to pursue a civil judgment. Her lender placed the design firm into supervised restructuring, and several clients left after learning about the conflict. Jason and Lauren separated within 2 weeks. He moved into a small apartment near downtown rather than the cottage. While she remained there temporarily with Emma under a written rental agreement, I did not evict Lauren because punishing Emma would have repeated the same cruelty I condemned. But the arrangement now had boundaries: rent, an expiration date, and no assumption that family connection erased responsibility. Lauren sent me a handwritten apology for the wine and the guardianship petition. I believed she regretted the consequences and perhaps even the harm. I did not mistake regret for restored trust. I replied with one sentence: I accept that you are sorry. But forgiveness will not cancel what must be repaired. The probate court dismissed the guardianship petition after reviewing the independent medical evaluations and the evidence presented at the closing. The judge lifted the temporary restrictions and noted that a disagreement over business succession did not establish incapacity. With court approval, the company began the process of repurchasing Martin's shares under the Bad Act provision. The civil case continued, and I learned not to expect quick or perfect justice. Some money had moved beyond immediate reach. Lawyers warned that recovery could take years and that certain losses might never be repaid. Martin denied intentional theft through his counsel, claiming he had used unconventional vendor structures to preserve liquidity and that Northline misunderstood his role. Investigators would decide which claims supported criminal charges. I did not control that outcome. What I controlled was the company. We corrected the financial statements, informed major customers, restored supplier terms, and invited an independent accounting firm to review 5 years of records. 2 of the craftsmen who resigned agreed to return. 1 did not. Saving the business did not mean reversing every consequence of the betrayal. Jason sold back enough of his shares to cover part of the legal costs and losses tied to the false authority package. He retained a small minority interest because the review found no evidence that he received Hale Ridge money or understood Martin's full scheme before the final weeks. He lost his position, his path to automatic succession, and the identity he had spent 14 years building inside my company. I refused his request to return in a reduced role. You need to learn who you are. Somewhere my name cannot protect or diminish you. I told him. He found work months later as an operations manager for a regional cabinet manufacturer in Dayton. The title was smaller, the salary lower, and no one there cared who his father was. For the first time, his authority depended entirely on his performance. We met twice during that period with a family therapist. The sessions were uncomfortable, especially when I admitted that I had kept moving the standard for leadership because I feared retirement would make me irrelevant. Jason said my financial help had often felt like a contract whose hidden condition was obedience. Both things could be true without making his betrayal acceptable. I hired an outside chief executive named Marissa Benton, who had managed a family-owned manufacturing company through a successful succession. I created a 5-member board with 2 independent directors, required dual approval for vendor changes, and separated purchasing, payment authorization, and reconciliation. No friendship, including mine, would again substitute for internal controls. I also transferred 10% of future economic participation into an employee ownership trust that would vest over time. The people who had spent years building Whitaker deserved more protection than promises from whichever member of my family occupied the largest office. I remained chairman but gave up daily decisions on a written schedule rather than through vague conversations. The family trust remained unchanged for Emma's benefit, except that Margaret and another independent trustee would continue managing it until she reached an appropriate age. Jason and Lauren would have no authority over the house or land. Those choices reduced my control, but this time I surrendered it deliberately, with safeguards and clarity. There is a difference between being forced out and knowing when stewardship requires you to step back. 6 months after the closing, Jason came to my house alone carrying the brass office key he had used since becoming operations director. We sat in Susan's kitchen, where the old Hale Ridge invoices had first been questioned. He placed the key on the table and said, "I thought giving this back would feel like losing everything." I asked how it felt. He looked toward the workshop beyond the windows and answered, like finally admitting it was never mine just because I expected it. I did not hug him. He had not earned easy reconciliation, and I no longer believed love required pretending a wound had closed. I poured 2 cups of coffee and told him we could build a new relationship if it began with truth, respected boundaries, and no use of Emma as leverage. He agreed. We talked for an hour about ordinary things, his new job, Emma's school, the repairs needed at the cottage. When he left, he took the office key with him only long enough to place it in my hand rather than abandon it on the table. The suit I wore at the restaurant was eventually cleaned, but a faint shadow remained near the collar where Lauren's wine had soaked deepest. I kept the stained linen napkin in my desk, not as a trophy and not because I enjoyed remembering their humiliation. I kept it because that night marked the moment I stopped confusing generosity with permission. For years, I believed being a good father meant providing jobs, houses, loans, and second chances. I had been less skilled at providing limits, honest expectations, and the freedom to fail without blaming someone else. Jason called me selfish because I would not sign away control on command. Lauren threw wine because fear had convinced her that my dignity was an obstacle to her security. Martin relied on my loyalty because he believed I would protect our history rather than examine his actions. They were wrong about one thing. Setting a boundary did not mean I stopped loving my family. It meant I finally understood that love without truth becomes leverage, and a man who gives away his self-respect to keep the peace eventually loses both.